is the President and General Counsel for Charity Village, and she plays here a very key role in developing and supporting Charity Village's community engagement and content creation, especially related to education, advocacy, and sector news and trends. At Charity Village, Mary merges her background in media production and content marketing with her business and legal experience to help job seekers become career ready and to help employers attract, recruit, and engage employees from across Canada to the nonprofit sector. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you, Marina. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. While we're gathering today on a virtual platform, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands we are on today as residents of Turtle Island. On the eve of the First National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, it's important for all of us to take time to reflect on the history of the land on which we live and consider how each of us can support the 94 calls to action made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to contribute to a better future for everyone. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Metis, and First Nations people who call this land home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the mistakes and harm that is a part of our past and the realities and injustices of today, and to consider how we can, each in our own way, move forward in a spirit of truth, reconciliation, and collaboration. Thank you all. We're very pleased at Charity Village to be presenting this important webinar today in partnership with Imagine Canada. Earlier this year, Statistics Canada released the results of a survey exploring the diversity of charity and nonprofit boards in Canada. The results confirmed what many in the sector already knew, that those who identify as immigrants, persons of color, LGBTQ+ individuals, persons with a disability, and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are vastly underrepresented on nonprofit and charity boards of directors. We're here today to discuss the implications of these findings and what organizations can do to build a more diverse and equitable sector, starting with their boards. And now I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel. We're delighted to welcome the Honourable Ratna Omidvar, Senator for Ontario and Deputy Chair of the Special Senate Committee on the Charitable Sector. Senator Omidvar has over 30 years of experience working in the charitable sector at senior levels of management, as well as serving as a board director and a volunteer, including leading the Maytree Foundation. She has served as a board director and advisor on over 30 charitable boards, including public agencies, boards, and commissions. The Senator is an internationally recognized voice on migration, diversity, and inclusion. In April 2016, she was appointed to the Senate of Canada as an independent senator representing Ontario. Senator Omidvar was appointed to the Order of Ontario in 2005 and became a member of the Order of Canada in 2011, with both honors recognizing her advocacy work on behalf of immigrants and her devotion to reducing inequality in Canada. Welcome. Also joining us is Tania Cheng, an Imagine Canada board member. Tania is a change maker and systems thinker with over 15 years of experience working and volunteering in charities, nonprofits, social enterprises, and foundations. Tania currently supports women and non-binary social entrepreneurs as a director of process innovation at CEO, helping innovation companies design DEI strategies as director of design and strategy at Feminuity, bringing design thinking to nonprofits and foundations through independent consulting. Previously, Tania spent over a decade leading youth engagement programs and advancing environmental sustainability. Tania serves on the board of directors of Imagine Canada and previously served on the boards of Inside Out, TD Friends of the Environment Foundation, and the Otesha Project. We also welcome Trish Mandewo. Trish is an entrepreneur, mentor, board professional, politician, and author. She was elected to the Coquitlam City Council in 2018. She has won several awards, including being named a top 25 Canadian immigrant. She is the co-founder and CEO of Synergy Executive and Boards Consulting Group, a company that recruits and supports the advancement of Black, Indigenous, and visible minority subject matter experts and senior level executives seeking to take their voices and expertise to the boardroom, C-suite, and other decision-making tables. Trish has served on more than 15 boards and has a passion to help women, youth, and the BIPOC community. Her expertise is in board development, governance policy, procedures development, strategic planning with an EDI lens, stakeholder engagement, governance relations, and multi-sectoral relationship building. And so, welcome to our very distinguished panel. We're delighted to have you with us. So let's start with the fundamentals and address the why. Of course, many of us believe a board is much more effective and responsive and equitable when its members reflect the community that it serves. But I'd like to hear from each of you in your own experience, what you can tell us as to why it's so important now for boards to take action to become more diverse and equitable. Tania, I think perhaps you could start with us on the discussion.
Sure, happy to. First of all, thank you so much for having me, and I'm really honored to be part of the conversation today and to be joining you from the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, which is also known as Halifax. As for why diversity and equity are important for boards, I totally understand why we're asking this question in terms of framing this panel conversation, but I sincerely hope we're not actually still asking this question in our boardrooms. I feel like the answer is pretty obvious. Boards hold positional and decision-making power in organizations, right? They decide how resources are allocated, who leads the organization, what the organization stands for. And so if you're an organization that professes to serve diverse communities and your board isn't inclusive of different perspectives, especially those from communities that have been put at the margins of society, then you're just not going to make the best decisions. And that's, that seems so obvious, but yeah, that's why it's important to me, and I certainly hope we're going to move beyond the why and towards the what and the how in this conversation.
Absolutely. And Trish, your thoughts about this?
Thank you, and also thank you for having us. So Tania, the unfortunate thing is that even today, we still have to talk about the why, because there are so many people that still don't get it. One of my favorite books is Simon Sinek's Start With Why. And so I do really feel that we need to continue to just hammer it until everybody gets it. So to everyone who is listening, I think the why is right around you, it's right within your own organizations. I challenge you to just think for a moment right now to say, who are the communities that you're serving, and who is in that middle management in your organizations, but more so, who is sitting in the decision-making table, right? Who is in the board, who is in the C-suite? And you will see that the hierarchy changes. There is diversity all the way to middle management, and then it stops there. The reality is that the boards in the senior level management has limited number of visible minorities, almost like sometimes you will find a token here and there, but that representation of who really is in the communities is not there. So the question to you is, why is it like that? Why is the power only put in the hands of a few people who look alike, think alike, and probably have similar experiences, right? So it is time for us to look at that holistically and say, we need to make sure that the people that we are serving and the people that are working in the lower positions also have access to those higher positions. And that is, in general, the why.
And Senator, did you have anything to add?
Well, a bit of the same, but let me perhaps put it a little differently. The boards of governors of charities and not-for-profits have huge influence, impact, and reach. As Tania and Trish have said, they determine how the money gets allocated and spent, but they also approve institutional policies. And so whilst we may think of these as abstract, but they are real. They touch on who gets hired, what services get procured. They dig into harassment policies. There are policies around promotions, and charities are not a small part of society. We may be overlooked. I say we because I identify myself very much as part of the sector. There are 85,000 charities in Canada and more than 85,000 not-for-profits. And just before the pandemic, they employed close to 2 million Canadians, and they constituted 8% of the GDP. Now that's significant. So what they do, who they are, and how they do it matters incredibly. And then, colleagues, there is the money. I'm not talking about millions. I'm talking about billions of dollars in grant money from all levels of government. And then you add charitable dollars to the mix. And the sector touches every aspect of Canadians' lives, from the young to the old, from the sick to the poor, from people who live in the east to the west. The sector has scope, it has reach. And yet, the level of governance transparency is low. We hold corporate boards to account annually at the AGM. We hold politicians to account every year, every 4 years when we go to the polls. But the boards of directors of charities and not-for-profits are out of our reach. And the question really is why, and how can we change that?
Well, Senator, you raised some excellent points there, and you've said previously that the results of the StatsCan survey on governance diversity in the charitable and nonprofit sector disclose really an open secret, that the open secret is that the sector is not diverse at the governance level. What did the StatsCan survey find? Can you take us through the highlights of that?
Sure. I should say that there are a whole bunch of us who've always had this suspicion that there is a governance deficit. There is a diversity deficit on the boards of directors, but there has never been any data that could be relied on. You know, at best, you looked around a boardroom and said, this feels out of sync. So it was really important to get evidence. And I think it was last summer in the middle of the pandemic, I issued a challenge to the directors of charities and said, count yourself. Let's get some evidence. And we were incredibly lucky to get the attention of Stats Canada to this question. And you know, their methodology is as tight as it can get. So they put out a national survey. It was crowdsourced, so it was voluntary. It is not statistically significant in that sense, but still, we got a picture into the sector. And the picture reflects the suspicions that whereas charities and not-for-profits touch the lives of minorities, of Indigenous peoples, of LGBTQ plus peoples, of people with disability, of First Nation, Metis or Inuit, that scale of population demographics is not reflected on their board. The only demographic group that is on par with Canada's population is women. Now that is great, but clearly, and we'll talk hopefully about intersectionality later on, but clearly the women on the boards of not-for-profits and charities are not minorities, they're not disabled, they're not Indigenous, and they may not, you know, we don't know, we don't have the fulsome data. They may not be LGBTQ plus peoples. What we need is an annual standardized form of gathering the evidence. So we know where we are, and it's only when you know the facts that you can direct the future and measure your progress against evidence as opposed to intuition, which is what we have used to date.
Well, thank you, Senator. I'd really like to hear from the other panelists. Trish, maybe you could tell us what your thoughts were about the report when you reviewed the findings.
Yeah, so when I reviewed the findings, I wasn't surprised because we know that. We already see it. But the sad reality is that even though the data speaks out and is there, if you go into the different regions in Canada and you ask people to self-disclose their boardrooms, right? Because the data is always changing and the boardrooms change every year. You notice that they have now started moving towards, one, not putting any pictures for the board of directors on the website. Two, some of them have now resolved to going to black and white photos, which again is a way to try to not give that data. And because the government comes in, a lot of times it's voluntary for you to share the data. So if you're proud of how your board is made up, so why not put it out there? We want to hear that story. Let that story speak for itself. But we find that there are some efforts even to hide, the actual makeup of the diversity, on lack of diversity, I should say, on the boards. So yeah, the numbers were not surprising, and they are really at par with how it is even in the C-suite and in the boards of private sectors. You find we have been doing a good job with the women, like Senator mentioned, but we still have a lot of room to go for women. But just to remind everybody, diversity, there's more than one dimension of diversity. Women is just one form of diversity, but we've got all these other forms of diversity that need to be reflected in the boardroom as well.
Yeah, that's so discouraging to hear of boards taking those steps not to disclose to avoid that. Tania, your thoughts about the report?
Similar to what Trish said, I think it told us what we already know, but I think it was a very important starting point in terms of the data collection. And I really want to thank Senator's efforts on making that possible and getting that work started. When I look at the data, I'm really curious about what's the actual experience of board members who may be coming from underrepresented groups. Are these folks able to actually meaningfully participate on the boards? And I'm curious about, an intersectional analysis of the data. So it's great that we're starting to collect some information about folks' identities, but I'm wondering about recognizing overlapping identities and lived experiences and how that impacts our experiences of prejudice and oppression and systemic barriers. And just even to lightly sort of provide an example of that. And first of all, actually, I should acknowledge that intersectionality is a framework that was coined by Black feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. And it came from this idea that the experience of Black women is different from the experience of Black men or white women, right? Oppression shows up differently. And so similarly, I'm queer, I'm a non-binary person of Chinese descent. I'm also able-bodied, I have class privilege. Like I can lift off a bunch of different parts of myself, but the point is none of these things exist independently, and all of them inform my experience. And so diversity has to be more than just ticking boxes. And bringing in intersectional lens mean really understanding that nuance and understanding that if I join your board, sure, I can tick off your LGBTQ box and your racialized box, but I can't speak on behalf of those groups. And my experience is vastly different than someone, let's say, who is Black and trans feminine or Indigenous and two-spirited, as example. So bringing that lens, I think, is really important in the data collection, the data analysis, and in decision-making on the board at the board level.
Absolutely, Tania, you kind of hint at this sense of tokenization and checking boxes as part of this. And I wonder, Senator, what are your views about the role, the influence of intersectionality in terms of how we see diversity on boards? Do you have any specific observations in that regard?
Well, as I said earlier, it is really encouraging to see the rise of women on boards, whether they are not-for-profit or for-profit boards. The progress may not be as quick as we would like it, but it is there. The problem I see, and this is a mirror on the intersectionality question, the problem there I see is that whereas the tide is rising, it's not lifting all boats. And we need to dig deep into the data, and we need to design questions and evidence with intersectionality in mind, because otherwise you may achieve a two-dimensional view of diversity, but you will not get a fulsome multi-dimensional view of diversity on your board, and that's what you need to get at. And diversity is just the beginning. It has to translate into inclusion, and that's a long journey. Taking a board from diversity to inclusion, it's not a linear journey. I will suggest it's more circular more than anything, but I'm sure Trish and Tania have more to weigh in on that. All I can say is that in a country like Canada, where evidence is not collected on issues on a national basis. So, for example, health data is collected provincially, and so you really don't get a fulsome picture of the nation. We need to put together an evidence gathering a strategy for the sector that takes all these issues into account, and we must make sure that it is a national picture that we get that is reconcilable with regional realities and urban realities, etc., etc. So, for instance, it won't surprise you to know that of those who filled in the survey that was put out by Stats Canada, urban settings, the boards of charities in urban settings are obviously more diverse for good reason. So you need that kind of analysis, and it can only be done if the questions are fulsomely designed.
Well, so we need to reflect on that, the nuances of what intersectionality brings to the table in terms of diversity, as well as the makeup of the kind of surveys that we'd be relying on for the data as well to reflect the real makeup of boards across Canada. That's quite true. I think, Trish, you've mentioned before that the Harvard Business Review has reported that majority of diversity programs fail. I want to talk to you, Trish, and hear from the panel about why you think that is. What are the biggest mistakes boards are making as they attempt to diversify?
Yeah, great question, Mary. Yeah, it is true that the Harvard Business Review, as well as the Gartner Group and other groups out there, have done research, and they have shown that about 60 to 80% of EDI initiatives fail. And the main reason is that they fail because of lack of consistent, visible, and actively engaged executive sponsorships is what they cited. But to unpack that, you notice that many of them treat EDI as the flavor of the month, for example, or as a marketing campaign. It's a good to have. They'll tick off this box, right? And they also start off with EDI bottom up, rather than starting from the board. It's great that we're having this conversation today about diversity in the boardroom, because the boardroom sets the strategic direction for the organization. So if the top management recognizes the importance of having this diversity, they are going to then inform all the policies, they are going to inform the bylaws within the organization so that they are really equitable and inclusive. The other thing that happens is they're putting no budget to this work. They're just saying, yeah, we need you to do this, but yeah, no budget, right? They're not like infusing it into the mission and vision of the organization, and they're not treating it as a priority. And if that's what happens, then you're not going to get any good results. So in a nutshell, that's what's happening there.
So Tania, do you agree that it has to come from the board and go through the organization, that they have to walk the talk and bring it from the top down as leaders of the organization?
I definitely agree with what Trish was saying around it needs to be a priority, and often priorities are set at the leadership level and it needs to be properly resourced. But in terms of what the biggest mistakes are, in addition to what Trish has mentioned, it's not doing the inner work at the board level and across the entire organization, and just assuming that diversity and checking boxes is enough. And doing that inner work looks like asking really good questions and having hard conversations about where does power sit in the organization and how are decisions made? What is your relationship to time, to money, to conflict, to each other? How are board meetings organized? Who runs them? Who does most of the talking? Where do people sit around the table? What ways of knowing and channels of influence are valued? There's so many questions that before we even start bringing lots of different people onto boards and assuming that, yay, we're done, we need to actually build a culture and an environment where folks can meaningfully participate.
Senator, I think you wanted to add something to that?
Just to add to that wonderful list of reflections and analysis, I sit on many boards, and I am constantly surprised about the flow of information. Information is key, and the information normally rests in the hands of the inner circle. And so policies need to be crafted on what information flows to the board. That's one point I wanted to add to what are the roadblocks to true inclusion, because if only a handful of people know the real inside story, well, then, you know, it's not really inclusive. When I was working in the field, roughly 10 or 15 years ago, we did some research, and I'm not sure the research holds today, but it was compelling at that time, that if in a group of 10, which may be the size of a board, one person is different, that one person is viewed as a token by everybody else. If there are two of a kind in a group of 10, those two are viewed as an interest group to be dealt with not in the mainstream, but offside. It is only when you get to 3 of 10, that you begin to get depth. So along with everything else, scope and scale also matters.
Such an interesting observation. So how can boards prevent tokenization and instead create a more meaningful experience for board members? Trish, what do you think about that issue?
Yeah, tokenization is something that we keep seeing over and over, because if you go back to what we're talking about, that people are using it as a check the box kind of thing. You know, you see people, often I talk to people and they're going, oh yeah, our organization is really diverse. We have got one Black person, and they're expecting me to smile really big because yeah, there's one Black person there. Or, you know, we have got one LGBTQ. Well, what does that really mean? Right? As Tania mentioned, you know, when you get on there and you are sitting there, but you've got no power, and you are part of that insider-outsider dynamics, as Senator said, you automatically, as one person, you automatically are on the outside. So you are there as a token because you're good to have, but you're not involved in the decision making. You are not making any impact, and we see that over and over. And as we're talking about here, nonprofits are one of those places where you are seeing this over and over. I can give an example of a board that I know that's in BC, where they do have one Black person, and that person called me very frustrated because they try to bring in, to the conversation, and they are not heard. And they try to talk to other people, and they are not heard. So what happens is that when you've got one, as Senator said, nobody's listening to you. Nobody amplifies you. You are just a single voice, and you're not going to make any impact. So we really need to try hard to make sure that we're going to bring people, at least 3, so that you can have that amplification of the voices happening in the boardroom.
Right. I think you've talked previously about that kind of experience makes these board members want to exit, that frustration of not being heard and not being taken seriously, and being seen as this as perhaps a token board member. Tania, would you agree with that that's a serious problem that has to be addressed through policies and the structure of the board and the policies that they put in place?
Absolutely, yes. I think any of us who come from one of those boxes has experience with that and understand what we mean when Trish talks about tokenization. And I'll say, in addition to policies, there's many ways in practice that we can help to create that inclusive environment. So, for example, creating and holding space for those conversations about power and privilege, creating multiple ways to participate. Right, so it's not just that everybody's fighting for airspace, but there's lots of creative ways to use collaborative tools and asynchronous methods of collaboration to really hear different voices. There's, creating space for trust building, so that you're not just spending your board meeting going through business, but actually getting to know each other on a human level, or even having, say, an onboarding buddy to help folks navigate the culture of the board and feel welcomed.
I see you nodding your head, Senator. Do you agree?
I agree 100%. Sorry for the distraction. My phone is ringing. But you know, there are a number of practical and policy tools. I've just sort of completed a national search for a board that I'm on, and you know, whilst the work on this board is always going to be a work in progress, we did develop some foundational policies that will help us and others forward. So first, we developed a governance, diversity, and inclusion policy. A governance policy for the board is different for the from the diversity policy of the organization. So our diversity policy focusing on the board outlines the tools that we will use to achieve a fulsome version of diversity. And that includes board terms. It includes flexible size of the board. It includes a budget for track, because you know, if we're a national board, we want to be truly inclusive. We want to bring people together. That costs money. We have a board matrix where we check off competencies. No one person can meet all the competencies, but using a disciplined approach got us to a far more effective and diverse place than going helter-skelter, who knows who. We did use a network of network approaches, but the who knows who approach is deadly. Frankly, the who knows who approach has gotten us into this mess, and it will not get us out of this mess. We have to have a disciplined, policy-focused approach to inclusive governance.
It's very interesting. We've heard of matrices being used for different professional qualifications of board members, but you're quite right to turn it to the use to ensure that we have boards that are more diverse and not relying on networks and cronyism. I would put to you that those sort of relationships that are pre-existing as to where we find board members is really critical in terms of the recruitment of them. I want to step towards looking at what some of the concrete steps that are presently being taken to make change. Where does the federal legislation fit in, and what role does the CRA have to play in connection to T3010, for example? Senator, could you address some of the movement in that area?
Thank you so much, because that is my favorite question. I am a legislator, so I look at legislative tools as the instrument to make change. They're not the only tools, but they do have impact because they have legal teeth. Charity law has been, as we said in the Senate report, has been ignored for 50 years, and I'm trying to breathe, along with my colleagues, some life into it. So as a first, we need to gather information on the demographics of a board set against employment equity definitions on an annual basis. We need to do that on an annual basis so that we can gather trends and gather data and observe trends over time. Now, that is not legislation. It requires a simple regulatory change to the T3010, which every Canadian charity and every federally registered not-for-profit must fill out. It would be adding a question to that questionnaire. So that is essential. I am already on a campaign to get this done. I certainly hope the many people on this call will join me on this. The second is legislation, and let me look to legislation first and give you a proxy comparator. The corporate sector is regulated by Canada through federal laws, and of course the federally regulated employers must disclose data on an annual basis as per employment equity guidelines, but they must also table annual diversity plans, and they must disclose the demographics of their board annually. Okay, so we do all this for federally regulated employers, and yet we let the charitable sector off the hook. Not intentionally, I would suggest, but unintentionally. The sector has said again and again and again during the pandemic that we are an important part of society, we deserve attention, we deliver the services. Well then, the sector also needs oversight and legislation of the same kind. So I would propose legislation to mirror the legislation that we use in Canada. And this would include, for instance, it would include that every charity, just as federally regulated employers do, every charitable organization of a certain size, must table diversity plans, must implement them and report out on them along with diversity demographics. This would be the first legislative and regulatory step.
And Tania, what do you think of those initiatives?
Certainly, I mean, Imagine Canada is a policy advocacy organization, and we support the Senate committee's recommendations, and I believe adding the question in 23010 is one of those recommendations. I'll say that, you know, we certainly would like the federal government to consult with the sector on these issues and what types of policy instruments would work best for the sector, comparing corporate boards and not-for-profit boards. You know, it's a bit of apples and oranges. And so for us, it's, you know, we're focused on advocating for a home in government so that we can have these conversations and facilitate our collective advocacy.
And Trish, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I totally concur with the points that have been made so far, but I would like to add that having, you know, these bills with teeth is what's really what we need to have. We need to have accountability. Because if you look historically, you see that we have, you know, bills that come forward. We have initiatives that the government starts, like the 50-30 challenge, and, you know, they come forward, but there is no accountability. So the organizations look at it and they're wanting to be pushed in order for them to really do what they need to do. But if you just put it out there, they look at it and they wait. And they want to know what is it that they're going to do to me if I don't do it. So I love when Senator Ratna is talking about making sure that it has teeth. That is important. And please, 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 for all of us that are on the call to sign up to that and to continue to engage, to say, let's give it some teeth and let's make sure that it really does the work that is intended to come out of it.
Senator, you look like you wanted to add something there.
Well, I just want to agree with everybody, but I do think Tania has made an important point that I would like to reiterate and amplify her voice, and that which is the need for a home in government. All these issues will never be dealt with on a webinar or even by me in the Senate. I want to tell you that the Senate, although almost every senator sits on a board, it requires a lot of work to get things done. It requires a lot of persuasion, and that persuasion must be amplified by the people in the grassroots. But we also need the machinery of government, and we have no machinery of government that is dedicated to the not-for-profit charitable sector. The Charitable Charities report recommended a home in government. We borrowed the language from the Mowat School of Public Policy. And so I think in order to move this conversation forward, we need to have a home in government, and that will generate some of the solutions. I have legislation in the Senate that passed in the Senate, didn't make it to the House of Commons because an election was called, so I will try again. And this legislation will focus on making charitable giving more inclusive so that charities can use their charitable dollars to work with non-charitable partners who may not be charitable for a very good reason. And there are many reasons for that. So I would say the evidence has been built, the policy work has been done, the solutions are out there. We need the machinery of government to surround this and make sure that we take it further. So thank you, Tania, for making that point.
And could I add just one more thing, just because I am as a board member very proud of the Imagine Canada team for working on this, and one of the initiatives that Imagine Canada's team has been advancing is we've launched the Equitable Recovery Collective, and this is bringing together voices across the sector, a diverse set of voices, to develop sector priorities for the pandemic recovery. And so we're working with organizations like the National Association of Friendship Centers, IGAL, the Muslim Association of Canada, the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities, for example, and there's many other organizations to really co-create this policy agenda in terms of what our collective priorities are as a sector moving forward. So I just wanted to, as a board member, give the Imagine Canada team a shout out for that.
Yeah, and I had something quick to add to that too, to say that engagement piece that we have been talking about here and really engaging the grassroots is important, but I want to remind us that not all charities are big enough to be sitting at the table. I noticed that when it comes to visible minorities, there are so many smaller communities that are isolated that a lot of times don't get consulted on. So it would be good to really make it inclusive, even on the charity scale, to make sure that we consult the smaller ones that otherwise will not be heard, and also don't have to tap into that pot of money because they don't have capacity.
Thank you, Trish. I also wanted now to sort of move into the board, because we've touched on it with comments from Tania and Trish and your experience as Senator, but what policies can board implement to create sustained change in this area, moving from diversity and towards equitable and inclusive board practices? What can they do from a practical level to create policies internally to help this not just be about checking boxes, but how the process of running a board can be more inclusive and include diverse voices at the table? Tania, I wonder if you could lead us on this discussion.
Sure, I think we've mentioned a number of them already. One example is having a committee that is focused on this. And so Imagine Canada, as an example, we have an anti-racism and anti-oppression committee on the board, looking at how to involve other voices on committees is another way to bring in a diversity of voices. And then the other thing I'll add to that is, again, I think it comes down to our practices. It's how we work together, and also what really checking our beliefs and biases that we hold when it comes to board diversity. So when we're looking at recruitment, for example, really checking what we're asking for, and checking that against, whether there are stereotypes or myths that we hold in our heads about who is welcome on boards. Just as an example, I often hear boards say, oh, we want a fundraiser or an influencer, and our understandings or conceptions of that might exclude, say, folks with less class privilege to participate. Or sometimes we hear about, we're looking for people with, I'm putting this in quotes again, professional skill sets. And again, that sometimes may preclude those with less access to formal education to participate. So really checking our biases and reassessing how every single process that we take in terms of how we work together and who's welcome is really important.
And Trish, you've mentioned before the obligation for boards to create safe and brave spaces. I wonder if you could talk about that for the audience here today.
Yep, for sure. Before I jump onto that one, I just wanted to continue with what Tania started talking about, the way that we can improve the boards. Having KPIs is very important. We cannot correct anything that we are not measuring. If we don't have those KPIs, the key performance indicators, we are just kind of like the wind blowing everywhere. So it's important to make sure that they have that in place. And that starts with a landscape analysis. Moving on to the brave spaces, it is important to note that there's been a big conversation happening around the world about creating safe spaces. And we know that in the US, that word has been kind of like really misused. And some people look at safe spaces as a negative thing. So it is important to note also that the best thing is to create safer and brave spaces. And the difference within those two is that a safe place or a safer place is the one that you as an organization or as a board will say, this is what we want. We want to be inclusive. We want people to come and feel comfortable based on your purview. But when you create a brave space, you're creating a space where you are asking the person stepping into it to define what safety means for them. what needs to be true for them to truly show up as themselves and for them to show up and truly be able to contribute without having to cover or without having to kind of hide part of themselves. So that's what we need to gear towards, is to have the safer and brave spaces.
Wonderful. I do want to move to some of the questions that are coming in from our audience. And I'd like to start first with a question that comes in that said, how do you achieve diversity when you face a struggle to fill all the vacant board member positions in the first place? So maybe, Senator, you might have some advice to this individual.
So I'm trying to put myself in that question, in that there are lots of vacancies, and you need to be both, you need to have a functioning, smart governance board, and you also need to be inclusive of the world that we live in. So, you know, I have a response to this whole governance and diversity approach by suggesting that every organization should do a diversity audit of its governance policies. And who does those kinds of audits? I imagine people like Trish do them. I imagine organizations like Imagine Canada have templates and put them out. So there's a self-help tool. And that takes you beyond the who, which is the easy thing. Who do you know? Who can we get? Who's from the West? Who's from the East, et cetera, to the what and the how. So if you start there, then you get maybe to your strategic decisions on the competencies and attributes that you need in a board member, with diversity running not as a vertical kind of theme, but as horizontal theme across. So then if you do that kind of work and you have that kind of discipline, then you have a clearer picture of who and what you need. And then I would suggest, which is what I did in my latest experience, I picked up the phone and I used a network of network approaches. I talked to 10 people who connected me to 20 people, who connected me to 30 people. I did burn up a lot of data on this search, but I am so delighted by the results of our search, and the board chair said that this was the first time that the governance committee put forward names that he had never heard of, and we thought that was a win. That was a complete win. So, you know, I want other people to share their journeys, maybe on a blog or something, so that, you know, points of light together, pulled together, will make for a searchlight. And that's what we need to do.
Can I add to that, Mary?
Yes, absolutely.
What Senator did, calling all those people, takes time. So the number one mistake that boards do is they are reactive. They do not engage in succession planning. You need to be recruiting for board members 2 years from now today, right? So they wait until very last minute, and then they're just now tapping people's shoulders because they need to fill the board position now. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of succession planning and really looking at it 2 years ahead of time or even more.
Trish is so right. The governance committee should not just be struck to nominate candidates. It should be a standing committee that meets as regularly as the finance committee. And if you do that, this is what Tania was saying, you're putting the stress where the stress belongs.
Well, Tania, I want you to add any comments you might have, but I also have a question from the audience that I want you to address. It says, I wonder about the specific questions to ask regarding diversity demographics, as Tania mentioned, to receive fulsome information into what we know about intersectional identities.
I'll try and remember all the things to address. So with respect to board vacancies, absolutely what Trish and Senator have already mentioned. And I think just so one more point to add to that is taking a step back and rethinking what governance means at your organization. because it's not just the board. And so certainly take a look at your bylaws. Can you add a seat to your board?
Yeah.
And if great, you could do that. And if for whatever reason that's not possible, can you invite other folks to participate on your committees? Certainly on the nominating committee, who then decides who is on the board. There are many different ways to address that question. With data collection around intersectionality, I think there's a really long answer to this. I'll try and keep it brief. I think it's about being specific in the data collection. So even when you look at the various categories, racialized, LGBTQ, et cetera, really creating space for the multidimensional ways that people show up. And that means being specific about what we're asking for, and then also asking about people's experiences, because again, like checking the box is not enough, and also not tying a single person to just one identity, and really recognizing the difference between the counts of identities and the counts of people. I'm not really explaining this super well, but there's a approach to that can be mindful of how folks with multiple identities go through that experience, and asking questions about what people's experiences are is really important.
Well, I have a related question that comes in. I think it's very interesting. Boards, this person says, are often coming from the best of intentions and wanting broader community voices on the board, which puts a unique expectation on these board members that they speak on behalf of an entire community or group. Are there any ideas to address this mindset? Tania, you already sort of addressed that earlier. Anything to add on that score? And then I'd love to go to Trish and the Senator to also respond.
So the question is,
well, there's a reliance on that individual to speak on behalf of an entire community or group, and how to address this mindset and get around it to be effective and fair to that board member, presumably, but still be being more responsive to the needs of the community that they come from.
Yeah, I can. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I mean, like what we've said around having more than one is incredibly important. I struggle with this personally, and I don't have the best answers to this question, to be honest. But I think having folks show up as allies in solidarity is really important. So regardless of what background or experience you have, really amplifying the voices of others, providing a platform for others to share their perspectives, and then supporting them when they speak up is really key to making folks feel included and heard.
And Trish, anything to add there?
Yes, so for us, when we do board recruitment, one of the things that I always tell boards is that if you're bringing in this diverse voice, they're not coming to be your EDI consultant. They're not coming in to speak on behalf of the community like this individual just asked. They're coming in with their skill set, with their lived experiences. They're coming in just like everybody else. So don't put the burden on that one person to be your educator on all things EDI. So I think it's already mentioned that the way to get around that is to make sure that if you need that education, bring in an outside organization to come educate you. But let the board member be just a board member when they are there. And if they wish like they need to share, let them do it willingly, but do not put the pressure on them to be able to educate you.
Absolutely. Senator, anything to add there?
I guess I have a bit more of a nuanced approach to this question. I have sat on boards since the mid-1980s, and I didn't know what that meant. I was just incredibly flattered that someone had asked me to join a board, and I was the veritable token. So whilst I reject the token approach today, I have been part of tokenism, but I think I also have used that. If here's my, it goes both ways. If you want to have me on your board, I am going to use my voice, my lived experience, and whilst I cannot speak for every short woman with short hair, I will bring that perspective to the table, and I will bring it loudly to the table. So I have used, and some would say abused, I don't know, that perspective time and time again. So, I will use every tool at my disposal. to stretch conversation.
Can I add very quickly to say I totally agree with Senator, because I actually have never considered myself a token, because if you invite me to the table, I am going to talk, and you are going to hear me. So in that way, I look at it as a privilege to be there to share my voice, but I truly, though, have seen it the other way, where people are tokenized and they're silenced.
And
Tania?
thankfully, there are programs now that support folks to participate on boards and navigate those systemic barriers. Just as an example, formerly Girls 20 has a great program for young women and gender diverse youth to do exactly that. So there's lots of support out there. But yeah, use your voice, be heard, be loud.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think our time together is coming quickly to a close. On behalf of Charity Village and Imagine Canada, I'd like to thank our exceptional panel for sharing their expertise and personal insights on making nonprofit and charitable boards more diverse, equitable, and inclusive, and helping provide nonprofit professionals, board members, and leaders to build a strategy for meaningful and lasting change. And I'd also like to express our appreciation to the audience for your attention and sharing your observations and questions. We really do need to keep this dialogue going. So thank you so much for joining us, and join me in thanking our panel. And now I'll turn it over to Marina Dawson for some final thoughts.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you. I also want to echo that, Mary. It was a wonderful discussion to take part in today, and we so appreciate all of our panelists being here. Before we sign off today, I want to remind all of our attendees that you will receive a follow-up email later today with a link to the video recording of this discussion. Please feel free to share this link with your colleagues, as it will be publicly available. And of course, we want to make this discussion as widely available as possible. The email will also include a survey link that you can fill out with your feedback on today's event. As a reminder, our Charity Village Conference and Awards are coming up on November 3rd, and you can still submit your award nominations. We have categories available for individuals and organizations, with awards recognizing excellence in diversity, equity, and inclusion, fundraising, workplace mental health, youth engagement, and more. So please visit charityvillageconference.com for more information, and we will also include a link in the email follow-up that you receive later today, just in case you'd like to submit a nomination. On behalf of Charity Village, thank you again for taking part in today's event, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.